The morning of August 8, 1942, on Guadalcanal, Japanese construction supervisor Inoue Hama stood at the edge of what should have been his greatest achievement, a nearly completed airfield carved from jungle and coral. The night before, his crews had received extra sake rations for finishing ahead of schedule. Now, American Marines were swarming across the runway his men had spent weeks building with shovels, pickaxes, and sweat. But Hama wasn't watching the Marines. He was watching what they were unloading from their ships. Crates. Hundreds of crates, each stenciled with words he couldn't read but would soon understand. Pierced steel planking. In 72 hours, those crates would become something that would haunt Japanese commanders across every island in the Pacific, the sound of American air power arriving faster than seemed physically possible. This is the story of how a simple piece of perforated steel, weighing 66 pounds and measuring 10 feet long, became the weapon that made the Japanese High Command realize they had already lost the war, not through any single battle, but through something far more terrifying, the industrialization of speed itself. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why a piece of metal with holes punched through it could decide the fate of empires, you need to understand what the Pacific War actually was. Every history book will tell you about aircraft carriers and island invasions, about Midway and Iwo Jima. But beneath all of that, the Pacific War was a contest of a single question: who could build airfields faster? Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had understood this as early as 1936, when he predicted that naval operations in the next war would consist of capturing an island, building an airfield, and using that base to gain control over the surrounding waters. His prediction was correct. His nation's ability to execute that vision was not, because in December of 1941, when Japan began its rampage across the Pacific, both sides entered the war with fundamentally different approaches to the same problem. The Japanese approach was rooted in a military culture that had spent decades perfecting tactics, training elite pilots, and building some of the finest aircraft in the world. What they had not perfected was something far more mundane: construction. Japan's pre-war military budgets had poured resources into warships, infantry divisions, and aircraft. Construction equipment received almost nothing. When Japanese forces captured an island, they arrived with picks, shovels, and human labor. They had some mechanized equipment, power rock crushers, concrete mixers, mobile power saws, but bulldozers and power shovels were in desperately short supply. The backbone of Japanese engineering was manpower and horsepower, literally, horses. The mathematics of this approach were brutal from the start. In the first 10 months of the war, the Japanese Navy managed to complete exactly one new airbase, Buin, on Bougainville Island. It had a single runway. When it opened on October 8, 1942, 7 of the 15 Zero fighters that landed there were badly damaged because the field was still rough and inadequate. Heavy rains turned it into mud. When flying unit ground crews reported that Buin was unfit for operations, Admiral Matome Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, didn't order more construction resources. He wrote in his diary, "How weak-minded they are. This is the time when every difficulty should be overcome. Don't grumble, but try to use it by all means." The pilots tried. They damaged approximately 10 aircraft per day when the runway was wet. This wasn't incompetence. This was the inevitable result of a strategic blind spot that ran through the entire Japanese military establishment. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had spent decades developing tactical brilliance, while ignoring the industrial and logistical foundations that made sustained warfare possible. They had planned for a short war, a decisive war, a war that would be won through superior fighting spirit and tactical execution. They had not planned for a war where the ability to pour concrete faster than your enemy could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. The Americans, meanwhile, were solving a different problem in a different way. In December of 1939, more than 2 years before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers received a design directive that must have seemed almost bureaucratic in its mundanity. Develop temporary runway matting for the rapid construction of airfields. The British had already attempted this. They used a material similar to heavy-duty chicken wire. It failed. The French tried a grid of steel chevrons. It also failed. But the Americans had something the British and French didn't have in 1939: time, industrial capacity, and an engineer named Gerald G. Greulich. Greulich worked for Carnegie Steel Company, and he approached the problem with an engineer's mindset rather than a military one. The question wasn't how to build a better airfield. The question was how to make an airfield that didn't need to be built at all, one that could simply be assembled. Development began at Langley Field in Virginia in December of 1939. By May of 1940, responsibility shifted to the engineer board at Fort Belvoir. The early versions were solid steel, ribbed for strength. They were far too heavy. During the winter of 1940 to 1941, someone had a realization that would change everything. The steel didn't need to be solid. Punch holes through it. The final design was elegantly simple. Each section measured 10 feet long by 15 inches wide. 87 holes were punched. Through each plank in a precise pattern 3 holes wide by 29 holes long. The holes weren't circular by accident. They were flanged, with the edges bent upward to create U-shaped channels between the holes. This served multiple purposes. First, it reduced the weight by 17.5% compared to solid steel, bringing each plank down to 66.2 pounds, heavy enough to stay in place, light enough for 2 men to carry. Second, the flanged holes created structural rigidity, turning a thin sheet of steel into something that could support aircraft weighing tens of thousands of pounds. Third, the holes provided drainage. Rain and water could flow through rather than pooling on the surface. Fourth, and perhaps most ingeniously, the holes allowed vegetation to grow through them. This might sound counterintuitive, but it was brilliant. The vegetation, combined with crushed coral or soil often laid beneath the matting, created a sandwich effect that absorbed moisture and reduced the clouds of dust that aircraft kicked up during takeoff and landing. The edges of each plank featured hooks on one side and slots on the other, allowing them to interlock. No bolts. No welding. Just hooks and slots that could be connected with sledgehammers. But a good design on paper means nothing without testing. And so, in November of 1941, the U.S. Army conducted the largest military exercises in its history, the Carolina Maneuvers. 500,000 troops spread across North and South Carolina, conducting mock warfare on a scale America had never attempted before. And in the pine forests near a tiny whistle-stop town called Marston, North Carolina, engineers began building something extraordinary. They cleared and graded an area 350 feet by 3,800 feet. They moved 50,000 cubic yards of earth, and then they began laying steel planking section by section, hooks into slots, hammered into place. The runway measured 3,000 feet long by 150 feet wide. It took 11 days to complete. General Henry H. Arnold, Chief of the U.S. Army Air Corps, visited the site personally. He called it the year's greatest achievement in aviation warfare. Not the paratroopers, not the tanks, not the aircraft, the runway. Because Arnold understood something that many officers didn't yet grasp. In the coming war, the side that could project air power from more places, faster, would win. And this steel matting, officially designated as pierced steel planking, or PSP, made that possible. When the Carolina maneuvers ended, the runway was dismantled. 18 railroad gondola cars carried it back to Langley Field, Virginia, but the steel took something with it that would last far longer than any individual airfield: a name. Soldiers and engineers who had worked near that small North Carolina town began calling it Marston Matting. The name spread, it stuck, and by the time those railroad cars reached Virginia, the world had changed. It was December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. America was at war. And suddenly, that 11-day construction time in North Carolina didn't seem fast enough at all. The early months of 1942 were catastrophic for the Allies in the Pacific. The Japanese war machine swept through Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands with a speed that shocked the world. Hong Kong fell. Singapore, supposedly impregnable, surrendered. The Philippines were overrun. Wake Island, Guam, all captured. By mid-1942, Japan controlled a vast empire stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands, from the Aleutians almost to Australia. And everywhere they went, they tried to build airfields. The results were mixed at best. At Guadalcanal, Japanese engineers arrived in early May of 1942 to survey Lunga Point for an airfield. The site was chosen relatively flat ground between past, the Lunga River and the Ilu River, suitable for construction. On July 6th, 2 construction units arrived, one with 1,379 men, another with 1,145. In mid-July, another 250 civilian workers joined them, part of the Hummer construction unit. With local labour added, more than 3,000 people were working on the airfield. They used the tools and methods they had, picks and shovels. Some heavy construction equipment. The Japanese military did possess concrete mixers, rock crushers, and other machinery, though never in sufficient quantities. Crucially, they used the captured American and Australian equipment found on the island. The work went well enough that by the night of August 6, 1942, the construction crews received extra sake rations for completing the airfield ahead of schedule. They celebrated. They had reason to. By their standards, by the standards of manual construction in Seven, jungle terrain, they had accomplished something impressive. The runway wasn't perfect, it was rough. It needed work, but aircraft could use it. The Japanese planned to name it Lunga Point Airfield. They never got the chance, because as they celebrated on the night of August 6th, an Allied invasion fleet was sailing toward Guadalcanal. At 9 to 10 on the morning of August 7th, 11,000 US Marines came ashore between Collie Point and Lunga Point. Japanese resistance was scattered and panicked. The construction units and the few combat troops on the island fled into the jungle, leaving behind food, supplies, intact construction equipment, and 13 dead. By 4 in the afternoon on August 8th, the Marines had secured the airfield. They found it nearly complete, with the Japanese equipment still in place. And they found something else in the supplies the Japanese had left behind, a level of preparation and organization that suggested the Japanese had planned to hold this island for a long time. The Marines renamed it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, the first Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. And then they did something that would be repeated on island after island across the Pacific for the next 3 years. They called in the Seabees. The United States Navy Construction Battalions, Seabees, from the initials CB, were something new in military history. They were combat engineers who could fight if necessary, but whose primary mission was to build. They arrived with bulldozers, graders, rollers, and most importantly, ships full of perforated steel planking. The 6th Naval Construction Battalion took over Henderson Field. They used abandoned Japanese equipment. They used their own machinery, and they used Marston matting. Within days, Henderson Field was operational, not just usable, operational. The first aircraft to land was a PBY Catalina flying boat on August 12th, carrying a survey team. On August 20th, 31 Marine fighters and dive bombers flew in from the carrier USS Long Island. Henderson Field became the base for what would be called the Cactus Air Force, named after Guadalcanal's Allied code name. These aircraft immediately began interdicting Japanese shipping and supporting the Marines on the ground. But here's what made the Japanese commanders pay attention: the speed. The Japanese had spent weeks building that airfield with thousands of workers. The Americans had it fully operational, improved, expanded, and supporting combat operations in less than 2 weeks after capturing it. And they were just getting started. because by late 1942, the evolution of Marston matting had accelerated dramatically. The 11 days it took in North Carolina in 1941 was now obsolete. Engineers and Seabees had learned from experience. They had refined their techniques. They had developed standardized procedures. A virgin site, pure jungle or coral, island could now be transformed into an operational airfield in under 100 hours. 100 workers could lay a 3,000-foot runway using 1,200 tons of matting in less than 100 hours. 4 days. From jungle to aircraft operations in 4 days. But even that wasn't the final evolution. By 1943, with veteran Seabee battalions who had built airfield after airfield, the time dropped even further. A 5,000-foot-long by 200-foot-wide runway, large enough for heavy bombers, could be completed in 48 hours, 2 days. Let that sink in for a moment. 2 days from landing on a hostile island to having bombers taking off to hit the next target. This wasn't theoretical. This wasn't propaganda. This was happening across the Pacific, and Japanese commanders were watching it happen. They were watching through reconnaissance flights. They were watching through intelligence reports. And they were watching with their own eyes as they were driven from island after island, each one transformed into an American airbase almost overnight. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Japanese military planning had been built around the assumption that airfield construction took months. You captured territory, you built an airfield over several months while your forces consolidated and your enemy regrouped, and then you used that airfield to project power forward. The entire rhythm of offensive operations was built around this timeline. The Americans had collapsed that timeline into 2 days. Every tactical assumption, every operational plan, every strategic calculation the Japanese had made about the pace of war in the Pacific was suddenly obsolete. And there was another factor that made this even worse for the Japanese: repairability. When the Japanese bombed Henderson Field, and they bombed it constantly throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, the Americans could repair the damage faster than seemed possible. Seabee construction units built repair stations along the runway. Each station included stockpiles of extra matting and foxholes for the repair crews to shelter in during raids. When bombs cratered the runway, crews would emerge from their foxholes and begin repairs immediately. 100 Seabees could repair the damage from a 500-pound bomb hit on an airstrip in 40 minutes. 40 minutes. From bomb explosion to fully repaired runway, you couldn't tell the airstrip had ever been hit. Allied intelligence estimated that Japanese repair crews, working with manual labor and limited equipment, took approximately 3 hours to make inadequate repairs at their forward air bases. This disparity, 40 minutes versus 3 hours, meant that American airfields were operational during almost all daylight hours, while Japanese airfields remained vulnerable and often unusable for extended periods after raids. The mathematics of attrition were unforgiving. More operational time meant more sorties. More sorties meant more bombs dropped on Japanese positions, more Japanese aircraft destroyed, more Japanese shipping sunk. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to that moment on Guadalcanal in August of 1942, when Marston matting was still relatively new, still being proven in combat conditions. Because what happened on Guadalcanal would set the pattern for everything that followed. The Japanese military establishment, looking at their failure to recapture Henderson Field, didn't initially understand what they were seeing. They thought it was a local problem, a tactical setback. More troops, more determination, more attacks, these would solve the problem. Between August and November of 1942, the Japanese launched multiple offensives to retake Henderson Field. The battle for the airfield became the focal point of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. 7 major naval battles were fought in the waters around the island. 3 major land battles were fought for control of the airfield perimeter. The Japanese suffered horrific casualties. Estimates suggest between 2,000 and 3,000 Japanese soldiers were killed in the October offensive alone. The attacks failed, not primarily because American forces were superior, though they fought with great courage and skill, but because Henderson Field kept operating. The Marines and Seabees held the perimeter, the aircraft kept flying, and as long as those aircraft could take off from Henderson Field, they controlled the waters around Guadalcanal during daylight hours. The Japanese could only resupply their forces at night, using high-speed destroyer runs that became known as the Tokyo Express. It wasn't enough. By December of 1942, Japanese commanders acknowledged that recapturing Henderson Field was impossible. In February of 1943, they evacuated their remaining forces from Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. Japan had lost. But more importantly, something had crystallized in the minds of Japanese commanders who were paying attention. Commander Masataka Chihaya, looking back after the war, articulated it with painful clarity. When we compare our clumsy result with what our enemy accomplished, building huge airfields in good numbers with inconceivable speed, we cease to wonder why we were utterly beaten. This wasn't bitterness. This wasn't making excuses. This was a professional military officer acknowledging a fundamental truth. Japan had been outbuilt, and in a war where airfields determined control of sea and land, being outbuilt meant being outfought. The irony is that Japanese commanders understood this. They weren't stupid. They weren't blind to logistics. Many of them had studied at Western military academies. They understood industrial warfare. Admiral Yamamoto himself had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He had seen American industrial capacity firsthand. He had warned his government that Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. But understanding something intellectually and experiencing it viscerally are different things. And as the war progressed through 1943 and into 1944, Japanese commanders experienced it over and over again. The Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Carolines, the Marianas. Each island group told the same story. American forces would land, Japanese forces would resist, often ferociously. But within days, sometimes within 48 hours, American aircraft would be operating from newly constructed airfields. Those aircraft would then support the next operation, the next island, extending American air power forward like a ratchet that only turned one direction. At Noem4 Island in Dutch New Guinea, the pattern reached almost absurd efficiency. American forces landed on July 2, 1944. The island had 3 Japanese airfields, all captured. Within the American task force were 5,500 support personnel. 3,000 of them were assigned specifically to rapidly upgrading the Japanese airfields and constructing new ones if needed. 3,000 construction workers, landing with the assault force, ready to start building before the shooting had even stopped. This wasn't improvisation. This was doctrine. This was standard operating procedure. The Americans had industrialized airfield construction to the point where it was as routine as unloading ammunition or establishing a field hospital. More routine, actually, because the airfields came first. Everything else depended on them. And still, Japan couldn't match it. The reasons were multiple and interlocking. First, Japan lacked steel. Even if Japanese engineers had designed something equivalent to Marston matting, Japan couldn't produce it in the quantities needed. Steel production was prioritized for warships, aircraft, and weapons. The amount of steel required to produce 2 million tons of runway matting. The amount the United States eventually produced would have required Japan to significantly reduce production of combat equipment. It was an impossible choice, but it also reveals the core strategic problem. Japan was trying to fight an industrial war without an industrial base to support it. Second, Japan lacked shipping. Even if they could produce steel matting, they couldn't transport it. Japanese merchant shipping was under constant attack from American submarines. By mid-1943, Japanese logistics were collapsing. They couldn't get adequate supplies to their forward bases, let alone transport massive quantities of construction materials. Third, and perhaps most damningly, Japan lacked the machinery. Bulldozers, graders, rollers, power shovels. The Americans brought all of these to every landing. The famous Caterpillar D7 bulldozer became as iconic as the Sherman tank in the Pacific War. These machines could move as much earth in an hour as hundreds of men with shovels could move in a day. The Americans calculated that a single carry-all earth mover could move as much earth as 180 service troops with hand tools. Japan had some mechanized equipment, but never enough, and what they had often broke down in the harsh tropical environment without adequate spare parts or maintenance infrastructure. So Japanese construction remained dependent on manual labor, and manual labor, no matter how determined or numerous, could not build airfields at the speed required by modern warfare. The Japanese tried to make up for this with human will. They used native laborers, often treating them brutally. On Noem-4 Island alone, they worked more than 2,500 Javanese laborers to death, building an airfield. They used their own infantry as construction workers, pulling combat troops from defensive positions to dig and grade. On Bougainville in December of 1942, an entire engineer regiment and 3 rifle battalions of the 5th Division were assigned to airfield construction. It didn't work. It couldn't work. Because the fundamental equation wasn't about effort or determination, it was about productivity. One American with a bulldozer could outproduce 50 Japanese with shovels. 100 Seabees with Marston matting could build a runway in 2 days that would take thousands of Japanese workers months to construct if they could construct it at all. This wasn't a moral judgment. This was mathematics, and mathematics doesn't care about courage or fighting spirit. By 1944, the pattern was set and irreversible. The American advance across the Pacific was methodical, unstoppable. Each island captured became an airfield. Each airfield extended American air power forward. Each extension of air power made the next island easier to capture. The Japanese called it island hopping, but that phrase makes it sound almost casual, as if the Americans were skipping across the Pacific like stones across water. The reality was more like watching a machine operate relentless, mechanical, terrifyingly efficient. The Americans would isolate a target with carrier-based airstrikes. They would soften it with naval bombardment. They would land Marines and Army infantry. And within 48 to 72 hours, engineers and Seabees would have an airfield operational. The timetable was so reliable that operational plans were built around it. Admirals and generals planned their next moves based on the assumption that airfields would be ready within 3 days of securing the necessary ground. That assumption was almost always correct. Marston matting had become a weapon of war, as important as any aircraft or warship, perhaps more important, because it enabled everything else. And there's one more factor we haven't discussed yet. The matting itself lasted. Steel with high manganese content resists corrosion exceptionally well, even in tropical climates. Airfields built in 1942 and 1943 remained usable through 1945 and beyond. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, originally built by the Japanese and improved by the Americans with Marston matting, remained operational throughout the war. After the war, it was modernized and reopened in 1969 as Honiara International Airport, the main airport for the Solomon Islands. It's still operating today. Kadena Air Base on Okinawa, built rapidly after the American invasion in April of 1945, using Marston matting and other techniques perfected over years of Pacific construction, is one of the largest and most important American air bases in the region. 80 years later, it still serves its original purpose, projecting American air power across the Western Pacific. The matting that wasn't used during the war ended up everywhere. Approximately 2 million tons were produced, costing more than $200 million in 1940s money, several billion in today's dollars. Much of it was never used. After the war, it became surplus. In the Philippines, in Papua New Guinea, in islands across the Pacific, locals found new uses for it. The most common was fencing. Stand the matting upright, bury one end in the ground, and you have a corrosion-resistant fence that will last for decades. Miles and miles of fencing across the Pacific Island nations are made from old Marston matting. Most people who see it have no idea what they're looking at. They see perforated steel with distinctive holes, useful for keeping livestock in or intruders out. They don't see a weapon of war. They don't see the industrialization of speed. They don't see the tool that ended the Japanese Empire. But the Japanese commanders who watched these mats being laid in 1942, 1943, 1944, they knew. They knew exactly what they were seeing, and that knowledge was perhaps more psychologically devastating than any battlefield defeat, because you can rationalize a battlefield loss. Your troops were outnumbered. The enemy had a better position. The weather was bad. You can maintain hope that the next battle will be different. But watching the enemy build an airfield in 48 hours, knowing your own forces would need months to accomplish the same task, knowing this disparity exists at every island, at every front that's not a tactical problem, that's a strategic inevitability. That's watching your defeat happen in real time and being unable to do anything about it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. There's a moment I keep returning to in my research, a moment that encapsulates everything this story represents. It comes from the Philippines campaign in late 1944. By this point, the war had turned decisively against Japan. Everyone knew it. American forces were advancing steadily toward the Japanese home islands. The question wasn't whether Japan would lose, but how much longer the war would continue, and at what cost. On Leyte Island, Japanese forces were making their last major stand in the Philippines. American forces had landed on October 20th, 1944. The fighting was fierce, the Japanese resistance determined. But something else was happening that told the real story of the campaign. Within days of the initial landings, American engineers were already improving existing airstrips and constructing new ones. The Japanese had built several airfields on Leyte during their occupation. They had used thousands of forced laborers, working for months. The Americans captured these airfields and had them operational for their own aircraft within hours, not days, hours, and where no airfield existed, they built them. Tacloban Airfield became operational on October 27th, exactly 1 week after the initial invasion. Engineers had cleared the ground, graded it, and laid Marston matting while fighting was still ongoing in other parts of the island. Japanese pilots flying from bases on other Philippine islands could see it happening. They would conduct reconnaissance flights or bombing runs, and they would observe American construction equipment working. The next day, they would return, and the airfield would be larger. The day after that, American fighters would be taking off from it. This wasn't intelligence reports or radio intercepts. This was visual confirmation, repeated daily, that the Americans could build faster than the Japanese could destroy, and even destruction was temporary. When Japanese bombers managed to crater an American runway, which happened, though with increasing rarity, as American air superiority became overwhelming, the craters would be filled and the matting replaced within an hour or two. The Japanese didn't have an answer to this. They couldn't develop one, because the answer wasn't tactical or operational. The answer was industrial, and by 1944, Japan's industrial capacity was collapsing under the weight of years of war and the American submarine campaign that had devastated Japanese merchant shipping. Oil refineries were being bombed, factories were running out of raw materials, the civilian population was experiencing severe shortages. And still, the Americans kept coming, kept building, kept advancing. Let me give you some numbers that illustrate the scale of this disparity. By the end of World War II, the United States had produced approximately 2 million tons of Marston matting and its variants. That's 2 million tons of steel, punched with holes, manufactured to precise specifications, shipped across the world's largest ocean, and assembled into hundreds of airfields across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle. To put that in perspective, a single 5,000-foot by 200-foot runway required approximately 1,200 tons of matting. 2 million tons means the United States produced enough matting for roughly 1,600 runways of that size. They didn't build 1,600 runways. Much of the matting went unused, became surplus, but they could have. The production capacity existed, the logistics existed, the shipping existed, the trained personnel existed. Japan, by contrast, never developed an equivalent system. Not because Japanese engineers were incapable, they were highly skilled. Not because Japanese workers couldn't manufacture to specifications they could, but because the entire strategic framework of Japanese military planning had never prioritized this type of industrial logistics. They had focused on producing better aircraft, better pilots, better tactics. All of those things matter. All of those things are important in warfare. But in the Pacific, in a war that was fundamentally about projecting air power across vast distances, the ability to rapidly construct airfields mattered more. The American system for deploying Marston matting had become remarkably sophisticated by 1944. It wasn't just about the matting itself. It was about the entire infrastructure built around it. Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that formed the backbone of American logistics, could carry a complete airfield in a single cargo hold. The matting would be loaded in crates, along with all the tools, equipment, and supplies needed for construction. Bulldozers, graders, rollers, fuel, food for the construction crews, medical supplies, everything needed to establish an operational airfield. The ship would arrive at a newly captured island. Within hours, unloading would begin. Within 3 days, aircraft would be taking off. This wasn't a theory. This was documented, repeated, standardized practice. At Iwo Jima, one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, the pattern held even under the most difficult circumstances. The island was tiny, only 8 square miles, and covered in volcanic ash and rock. The Japanese had fortified it extensively, turning it into one of the strongest defensive positions in the Pacific. The battle began on February 19, 1945. It would last 36 days and cost nearly 7,000 American lives. But even while the fighting raged, even while Marines were dying on the volcanic slopes of Mount Suribachi, the construction battalions were working. Naval Construction Battalion 133 was assigned to make the southern airfield Motoyama No. 1 operational. They took casualties, heavy casualties. The assignments were changed multiple times as battalions were decimated by Japanese artillery and had to be reinforced or replaced. But the work continued. On D+6, 6 days after the initial landing, the assignments were reorganized. The 62nd Naval Construction Battalion was given Motoyama 1, the 31st was assigned to Motoyama 2, and the 133rd was assigned to the barely started Motoyama 3. The Seabees worked under fire. Japanese artillery targeted them constantly. They dug foxholes and worked between bombardments. They used bulldozers to clear rubble while mortar rounds exploded nearby. They graded runways while snipers took shots at them. And on March 16, 1945, 26 days after the invasion began, while fighting was still ongoing in other parts of the island, Central Field became operational. The runway was graded to 5,200 feet. American aircraft could land, refuel, rearm, and take off. This was while the battle was still being fought. This was while Marines were still dying, trying to secure the rest of the island. Think about what that means. Think about the Japanese defenders, dug into caves and bunkers, watching American construction equipment working on the airfield they had tried so hard to make unusable. Watching American aircraft landing and taking off, bringing supplies, evacuating wounded, conducting bombing runs against Japanese positions, all from an airfield that hadn't existed a month earlier. The psychological impact is difficult to articulate. Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima were told they were fighting for the survival of the homeland. The island was technically part of the Tokyo prefecture. They were, in their minds, defending Japanese soil. They had been ordered to make the Americans pay such a high price that the invasion of Japan itself would become too costly to contemplate. They fought with incredible courage and determination. The casualty rate was horrific on both sides. But even as they fought, even as they inflicted terrible losses on the American forces, they could see with their own eyes that the Americans were building the infrastructure to continue the war, that the island was being turned into an American airbase even while the battle was still underway, that nothing they did, no amount of courage or sacrifice, could stop this process. By April of 1945, 2 months after the invasion, Iwo Jima had multiple operational airfields. Thousands of American aircraft used them. B-29 Superfortress bombers, flying from the Marianas to bomb Japan, used Iwo Jima as an emergency landing site. Over the course of the war, 24,000 aircrewmen made emergency landings on Iwo Jima. Without those airfields, those men would have died ditched in the ocean or crashed trying to make it back to the Marianas. The battle for Iwo Jima cost 7,000 American lives. The airfields built there saved 24,000. This is the calculus of industrial warfare. This is what Marston Matting enabled. Not just the construction of airfields, but the construction of airfields fast enough and in sufficient numbers to save more lives than they cost. To project power forward faster than the enemy could respond. To make defeat not just likely but inevitable, and Japanese commanders understood this. The historical record shows us their growing desperation and their clear-eyed recognition of reality. After the war, many Japanese officers wrote memoirs or gave interviews. A consistent theme emerges. They knew they were losing long before the surrender in August of 1945. They knew because they could see it happening. Commander Chihaya's quote that I mentioned earlier, "When we compare our clumsy result with what our enemy accomplished, building huge airfields in good numbers with inconceivable speed, we cease to wonder why we were utterly beaten," wasn't unique. Other Japanese officers expressed similar sentiments. They watched the Americans build, they watched their own forces struggle, and they understood what it meant. There's a particular poignancy to this, because the Japanese military establishment wasn't ignorant of logistics. They had successfully conducted amphibious operations across the Pacific in 1941 and 1942. They had captured Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. They had demonstrated sophisticated operational planning, but they had planned for a short war. They had assumed that quick victories would lead to a negotiated settlement. They had not prepared for a sustained industrial conflict against an enemy with vastly superior productive capacity. And once that conflict began, once the Americans recovered from the shock of Pearl Harbor and began mobilizing their industrial base, the outcome was determined by factors that individual commanders couldn't change through tactical or operational excellence. This is what makes the story of Marston Matting so compelling and so tragic. It's not a story about heroic combat or dramatic last stands. It's a story about industrial capacity and logistical infrastructure. It's a story about the mundane, unglamorous work of construction elevated to a strategic weapon. And it's a story about the psychological weight of watching defeat approach, slowly and inexorably, knowing there's nothing you can do to stop it. Because here's the thing that haunts me about this story. The Japanese commanders who understood what Marston Matting represented couldn't share that understanding with their troops. They couldn't tell their soldiers, "We're going to lose this war because the Americans can build airfields in 48 hours, and we can't." That's not something you can say to men you're ordering to fight to the death. That's not something you can tell the civilian population you're asking to endure firebombing and starvation. So they kept fighting. They kept ordering attacks. They kept defending islands they knew couldn't be held. And all the while, they watched the Americans build. Island after island, airfield after airfield, the sound of bulldozers and the hammering of steel matting, louder, in some ways, than the sound of gunfire. Because gunfire meant battle. The sound of construction meant the battle was already over. The Americans were just going through the motions of securing what they had already won. Let me tell you about Okinawa, because it represents the culmination of everything I've been describing. The invasion began on April 1st, 1945. It was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. Over 500,000 Allied personnel were involved, including nearly 200,000 combat troops. The Japanese defending Okinawa knew this was the last major battle before the invasion of the Japanese home islands. They had fortified the island extensively. Over 100,000 Japanese troops, plus tens of thousands of Okinawan conscripts, were dug into elaborate defensive positions. The battle would last 82 days. It would cost 50,000 American casualties and over 100,000 Japanese military dead, plus somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilian casualties. It was, by any measure, one of the bloodiest battles of the war. And on the first day of the invasion, American forces captured 2 airfields, Yontan and Kadena. Within hours, American engineers were improving them. Within days, they were operational for American aircraft. By the end of April, 1 month into the battle, both airfields had been expanded and improved to the point where they could handle heavy bombers. The fighting was still raging. The Japanese were conducting mass kamikaze attacks against the American fleet, sinking or damaging dozens of ships. But the airfields kept operating. American aircraft flew from Okinawa to strike targets in Japan itself, on Kyushu and the other home islands. The airfields at Okinawa, particularly Kadena, were improved with Marston matting and other construction techniques that had been perfected over 4 years of Pacific warfare. And here's what's remarkable. Kadena Air Base is still one of the largest and most important American military installations in the Pacific. 80 years later, it's still doing exactly what it was built to do in 1945, projecting American air power across the Western Pacific. The runways have been improved and expanded, but they're in the same location, serving the same strategic purpose. This permanence matters, because it illustrates another advantage of the American approach. The airfields they built weren't just temporary expedients. They were infrastructure that lasted. They were the foundation of American power in the Pacific, not just during the war but for decades afterward. The Japanese, even if they had somehow found a way to match American construction speed, which they couldn't, would have been building temporary facilities that barely met operational requirements. The Americans were building bases that would last generations. This difference in scale and ambition reflected the fundamental strategic imbalance between the two nations. Japan was fighting for survival. America was building an empire. That might sound harsh, but it's historically accurate. The American airfields built during World War II became the backbone of American military power in the post-war Pacific. They enabled the occupation of Japan. They supported the Korean War. They were crucial during the Vietnam War. Many are still operational today. This wasn't accidental. This was strategic planning that looked beyond the immediate conflict to the long-term geopolitical order. And it was enabled, at least in part, by the fact that American construction methods built things that lasted. Marston matting, with its corrosion-resistant steel and modular design, could be laid quickly and would remain functional for years with minimal maintenance. Japanese airfields, built with manual labor and inadequate materials, often deteriorated rapidly in the tropical climate. Runways would develop ruts and cracks, drainage would fail, maintenance was constant and labor-intensive. The disparity wasn't just in construction speed, it was in the durability and long-term usability of what was built. Every advantage was compounded. Faster construction meant more airfields. More durable construction meant those airfields stayed operational with less maintenance. Less maintenance meant more resources could be devoted to other needs. It was a virtuous cycle for the Americans and a vicious cycle for the Japanese. By the summer of 1945, the war was approaching its end. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August would ultimately force the Japanese surrender, but even without those weapons, the outcome was certain. American air power, operating from dozens of airfields across the Pacific, was systematically destroying Japan's remaining industrial capacity. B-29 bombers flew from the Marianas, from Iwo Jima, from Okinawa. They firebombed Japanese cities. They mined Japanese harbors. They struck remaining military targets. The Japanese had no effective defense. Their aircraft industry had collapsed. Their fuel supplies were exhausted. Their pilot training programs couldn't replace losses, and crucially, they had no airfields from which to effectively contest American air superiority. The airfields in Japan itself, built over years with significant resources, were being bombed constantly. The Americans would crater the runways, and Japanese crews would repair them, and the Americans would bomb them again. It was futile. The arithmetic of attrition, which had played out across every island in the Pacific, was now playing out over Japan itself. And the Japanese had no answer. They had never developed an answer, because the answer would have required, years earlier, a fundamental restructuring of their entire military-industrial complex to prioritize construction capability and industrial logistics over tactical excellence and combat effectiveness. That's a choice no military wants to make, because it means admitting that wars are won in factories and shipyards, not on battlefields. It means admitting that the unglamorous work of construction and logistics matters more than the heroic image of combat. Most military establishments resist this admission. The Japanese military resisted it completely, and they paid the price. When the war ended in August of 1945, the infrastructure of American power was firmly established across the Pacific. Dozens of airfields, scores of naval bases, hundreds of supply depots and maintenance facilities. The Americans had built an empire of logistics, and it would endure for generations. The physical remnants of Marston matting are still visible today if you know where to look. In the Philippines, rural fences made from the distinctive perforated steel are common in older areas. In Papua New Guinea, sections of matting are used as roadway barriers, as bridge reinforcement, as roofing, for storage buildings. On some Pacific islands, you can still find sections of the original wartime runway, overgrown with vegetation but still recognizable. The steel was so well made, so resistant to corrosion, that it has outlasted almost everything else from the war. The aircraft that flew from those runways are in museums or scrapyards. The ships that transported the matting were scrapped decades ago. The men who laid it are mostly gone now, but the matting remains. There's something almost poetic about that persistence. The weapon that won the Pacific War wasn't designed to destroy, it was designed to build, and what it built has lasted longer than any bomb or bullet. I've spent a considerable amount of time researching this story, and I keep coming back to one image. It's from a photograph I found in an archive. I wish I could show it to you, but you can find similar images if you search for Pacific War construction photographs. The image shows Seabees laying Marston matting. Somewhere in the Pacific, the exact island isn't identified in the caption. You can see the sections of steel being hammered into place. You can see the holes in the matting, the hooks and slots connecting each section. You can see bulldozers in the background, moving earth, and in the far distance, you can see the jungle. The contrast is stark. In the foreground, industrial efficiency, straight lines, geometric precision, machines and men working in coordinated effort. In the background, nature chaotic, dense, impenetrable. And in between, at the junction of these two worlds, the airfield is being created, square foot by square foot, section by section, 10 feet at a time. The photograph is undated, but based on the equipment and uniforms, it's probably from 1943 or 1944. By that point, this scene was being repeated across dozens of islands simultaneously. Thousands of Seabees, laying millions of square feet of matting, building the infrastructure of American victory. And somewhere on another island, from a cave or a bunker or a camouflaged observation post, Japanese officers were watching similar scenes through binoculars, watching the construction equipment work, watching the airfield take shape, watching American aircraft begin to arrive, watching their defeat being constructed methodically and inexorably, faster than they could possibly prevent. That's the image that haunts me. Not the dramatic combat footage, not the famous photographs of flag raisings or naval battles, but this quieter image of construction under tropical sun, of industrial capacity being projected across thousands of miles of ocean, of the mundane work that determined the war's outcome. Because that's what war is, at its most fundamental level. It's not just about who fights better. It's about who can build better, who can supply better, who can maintain industrial production under pressure, who can solve the unglamorous logistical problems that don't make for exciting stories but determine whether armies can fight at all. The Americans understood this. Or rather, their system understood this, even if individual soldiers and commanders didn't always appreciate the significance. The American military-industrial complex, a phrase that wouldn't be coined until President Eisenhower's farewell address in 1961, but which accurately describes the system that existed during World War II, was designed to solve these problems, to produce, to ship, to build, to maintain, to turn industrial capacity into military power. The Germans never fully grasped this. They focused on producing technologically superior weapons, better tanks, better aircraft, while neglecting the logistics and infrastructure that would allow those weapons to be used effectively. The Japanese never grasped it either. They focused on tactical excellence and spiritual determination while treating logistics as an afterthought. The Americans, by contrast, made logistics central to their war effort, and Marston matting is the perfect symbol of that approach. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't technologically sophisticated, it was perforated steel, not radar or nuclear physics. But it worked. It was manufacturable in huge quantities. It was shippable across vast distances. It was deployable under combat conditions. And it enabled everything else. Without Marston matting and the airfields it created, American aircraft couldn't have operated across the Pacific. Without those aircraft, American naval forces would have been vulnerable. Without naval superiority, amphibious invasions would have been impossible. Without successful invasions, the war would have dragged on indefinitely. It's reductive to say that Marston matting won the Pacific War. Wars are complex, multifaceted events with countless contributing factors. But it's not wrong to say that Marston matting was one of the key enabling technologies that made American victory possible. And it's entirely accurate to say that the Japanese inability to develop anything comparable was one of the key factors in their defeat. The disparity in construction capability reflected and revealed deeper disparities in industrial capacity, strategic thinking, and logistical competence. These disparities were, ultimately, more decisive than disparities in courage or tactical skill. This is an uncomfortable truth. We want to believe that wars are won through heroism, through clever tactics, through superior fighting spirit, and those things matter, don't misunderstand me. The courage of the Marines who fought at Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, the skill of the naval aviators who won at Midway, the determination of the Seabees who built under fire, all of that mattered enormously. But it mattered within a context created by industrial and logistical superiority. The Marines could hold Henderson Field because the Seabees could make it operational. The aviators could fly from Iwo Jima because construction battalions built the runways. The courage and skill enabled American forces to execute the strategy, but Marston matting enabled the strategy itself. I realize I've been talking about steel matting for a long time now, and you might be wondering why this matters, why this story deserves this much attention. Let me tell you why. This story matters because it reveals something fundamental about how wars are actually won, not through the dramatic moments that make it into movies, but through the accumulation of small, unglamorous advantages. It matters because it shows us what happens when one side in a conflict has a decisive advantage in industrial logistics, and how that advantage compounds over time until it becomes insurmountable. It matters because it demonstrates the limitations of tactical excellence and fighting spirit when confronted with overwhelming material superiority. And it matters because the lessons of Marston Matting, the lessons of industrial warfare, of logistics as a strategic weapon, of the importance of construction and infrastructure, remain relevant today. Modern militaries still struggle with many of the same problems the Japanese faced in World War II. How do you project power over long distances? How do you establish and maintain forward bases? How do you keep your forces supplied and your equipment operational? The specific technologies have changed. Modern militaries don't use perforated steel planking, they use more advanced materials and construction techniques. But the fundamental challenges remain the same, and the fundamental lesson remains the same. In sustained conflicts between industrialized nations, logistics and infrastructure matter more than almost anything else. The side that can build faster, supply more effectively, and maintain operational readiness under pressure will almost always prevail, regardless of tactical setbacks or individual heroism. This is what the Japanese commanders learned as they watched Marston Matting being laid across the Pacific. This is what they understood when they said they ceased to wonder why we were utterly beaten. They had seen the future of warfare, and it looked like a construction site, not glorious, not dramatic, just methodical, inexorable, unstoppable. The sound of sledgehammers connecting steel sections, the rumble of bulldozers, the roar of aircraft engines starting up on runways that hadn't existed 3 days earlier. That was the sound of defeat, as surely as the sound of exploding bombs or gunfire. Perhaps more surely, because it was the sound of defeat that couldn't be prevented, only delayed. Every Japanese commander who watched American construction crews work, who saw airfields appear where the jungle had stood, who observed the speed and efficiency of American logistics, they all understood this. They all knew, and they kept fighting anyway, because that was their duty, because surrender wasn't acceptable, because hope and duty and honor demanded they continue, even when rational analysis said the war was already lost. There's a word for this in Japanese, gaman. It means enduring the unbearable with patience and dignity. The Japanese military establishment practiced gaman from mid-1943 until the surrender in August 1945. They endured the unbearable knowledge that they had lost, that nothing they did could change the outcome, that they were sending their soldiers and sailors and airmen to die in a cause that was already hopeless. They endured because the alternative surrender, admission of defeat, was culturally and psychologically impossible, until the atomic bombs provided an external catalyst that made surrender acceptable. This is the tragedy at the heart of the Marston Matting story. The weapon that won the Pacific War wasn't just the steel matting itself. It was the knowledge that the matting represented the knowledge of overwhelming American industrial superiority, the knowledge that Japan couldn't compete, couldn't keep pace, couldn't prevent the steady accumulation of American air power across every island, every atoll, every piece of captured ground. That knowledge, once it took hold in the minds of Japanese commanders, was as destructive as any bomb, because it meant that every subsequent battle was futile, every defense was temporary, every victory was meaningless in the broader context of inevitable defeat. And yet they fought on, for months, for years. The matting kept being laid, the airfields kept appearing, the aircraft kept flying, and Japanese commanders kept watching, kept understanding, kept ordering their men forward into battles they knew were unwinnable. When I think about this story, really think about it, let it sink in, it's almost overwhelming, the sheer scale of the industrial effort, the logistics of shipping 2 million tons of steel across the Pacific, the training of thousands of construction workers, the coordination required to have materials, equipment, and personnel arrive at the right place at the right time, again and again, across dozens of simultaneous operations. And on the other side, the growing realization among Japanese commanders that they couldn't match it, couldn't compete, couldn't find an answer. The quiet desperation of watching your enemy do something you can't do, knowing that this disparity, this single factor, is determining the outcome of the entire war. If there's a lesson here, and I think there is, it's about the nature of power in the modern world. Real power isn't just military force. It's the industrial capacity to produce military force sustainably, to project it over vast distances, to maintain it under pressure. It's the logistical infrastructure that seems boring until you don't have it, at which point its absence becomes catastrophic. It's the unglamorous work of construction and supply that enables everything else. The Japanese learned this lesson, too late to apply it, but they learned it thoroughly. In the decades after World War II, Japan became one of the world's leading industrial powers, renowned for manufacturing excellence and logistical efficiency. The lessons of defeat, the lessons taught by Marston Mats and everything it represented were absorbed and internalized. Perhaps that's the final irony. The nation that lost the Pacific War because of industrial inadequacy became, in peace, an industrial powerhouse. The commanders who watched American construction crews build airfields in 48 hours went home and helped build a nation that became a byword for efficiency and quality. But that's a different story. This story, the story of Marston Mats, is ultimately a story about time. Time compressed, time accelerated, time weaponized. In November of 1941, it took 11 days to build an airfield in North Carolina. That was revolutionary then. By 1943, it took 48 hours to build an airfield in the Pacific. That compression of time from 11 days to 2 days changed everything. It changed the pace of operations. It changed strategic calculations. It changed what was possible. And it revealed, starkly and unmistakably, which nation had the industrial capacity to fight a modern war and which didn't. When Japanese construction supervisor Inori Hama stood at the edge of the airfield on Guadalcanal on August 8, 1942, watching American Marines secure what his crews had spent weeks building, he couldn't have known that he was witnessing the beginning of a pattern that would repeat across the entire Pacific. He couldn't have known that the crates being unloaded from American ships contained a technology that would render Japanese construction methods obsolete. He couldn't have known that within 72 hours, American aircraft would be flying from that airfield, supporting operations that would eventually drive Japan from the Solomon Islands entirely. But perhaps he sensed something. Perhaps, watching the efficiency of the American logistics, the organization of their forces, the quantity of their equipment, he had an inkling of what was to come. We'll never know. Hama, like most of the Japanese construction workers on Guadalcanal, either died during the campaign or was evacuated during the Japanese withdrawal in February 1943. His story, like the stories of thousands of Japanese soldiers and workers who witnessed American construction capability firsthand, is mostly lost to history. But the evidence of what they witnessed remains. It remains in the archives, in the photographs of American construction crews working across the Pacific. It remains in the official histories, in the casualty reports, in the detailed logs of construction battalions documenting how many square feet of matting they laid each day. And it remains, physically, in the fences and barriers across the Philippines and Papua New Guinea, where sections of Marston Mats still stand, 80 years later, rust-stained but still functional, still doing useful work long after the war that created them has faded from living memory. These remnants are monuments, though nobody thinks of them that way. They're just fences to the people who live near them, just old steel barriers separating properties or keeping livestock contained. But they are monuments nonetheless, monuments to industrial capacity, monuments to the logistical excellence that won the Pacific War, and monuments to the Japanese commanders who watched these sections being laid and understood, with terrible clarity, what they meant for Japan's future. There's one more thing I want to mention before we close this story. It's about the men who laid the matting, the Seabees, the army engineers, the construction workers who did the actual physical labor of building these airfields. They weren't combat troops, though they often worked under fire. They weren't aviators, though their work made aviation possible. They were, in the military hierarchy, support personnel, unglamorous, necessary but not celebrated, and yet their contribution to American victory was arguably as important as any combat unit. Every section of matting they laid, every airfield they built, extended American power forward and made Japanese defeat more certain. They worked in heat that regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. They worked in tropical rain that turned construction sites into muddy swamps. They worked while Japanese artillery shelled them, while snipers took shots at them, while bombers tried to destroy what they were building. At Iwo Jima, construction battalions took casualties comparable to infantry units. They dug foxholes between shifts. They kept working through bombardments. They completed runways while the battle was still being fought. This wasn't the romantic vision of warfare. This was industrial labor under combat conditions. This was men operating bulldozers and graders and rollers, men hammering steel sections into place, men doing the unglamorous work of construction while people tried to kill them. They deserve to be remembered. Their names are mostly forgotten now. Individual Seabees and engineers don't get the recognition that combat heroes receive. But collectively, they were one of the most important forces in the Pacific War. Without them, without their work, American strategy would have been impossible. The island-hopping campaign depended on the ability to rapidly construct airfields. That ability depended on Marston matting. And Marston matting depended on the men willing to lay it under fire, section by section, 10 feet at a time. So this story is for them, too. For the construction workers who won a war by building. For the engineers who solved logistical problems that determined strategic outcomes. For the unglamorous, uncelebrated support personnel whose contribution made everything else possible. When we think about World War II, when we remember the Pacific War, we tend to remember the dramatic moments. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway, the flag raising on Iwo Jima. Those moments matter, they deserve to be remembered. But we should also remember the quieter moments. The sound of sledgehammers connecting steel sections, the rumble of bulldozers, the methodical, systematic work of construction that happened on dozens of islands simultaneously, creating the infrastructure of American victory. Because those moments, accumulated over years and across thousands of miles, determined the war's outcome as surely as any battle. The Japanese commanders understood this. That's why Commander Chihaya's words resonate so powerfully. When we compare our clumsy result with what our enemy accomplished, building huge airfields in good numbers with inconceivable speed, we cease to wonder why we were utterly beaten. He wasn't making excuses. He wasn't diminishing Japanese courage or tactical skill. He was acknowledging a fundamental truth, that wars between industrial nations are won by industrial capacity, and that Japan never had the capacity to match the United States in sustained industrial conflict. That truth was visible, tangible, undeniable every time American forces built an airfield in 48 hours, every time a bomb crater was repaired in 40 minutes, every time American aircraft took off from a runway that hadn't existed a week earlier. The evidence was overwhelming. The conclusion was inescapable, and Japanese commanders, watching it happen, understood exactly what they were seeing. They were seeing the future, and the future was perforated steel, laid in sections, extending forward across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide. Today, if you drive through the rural Philippines, you might pass a fence made from distinctive perforated steel. You might notice the holes, the pattern, the way the steel is weathered, but still strong. You probably won't know what you're looking at. Most people don't, but now you do. You're looking at a piece of the weapon that won the Pacific War. A weapon that didn't kill anyone directly, but enabled the deaths of hundreds of thousands. A weapon that wasn't designed to destroy, but to build. A weapon that was, fundamentally, a logistics tool, 10 feet of steel with holes punched through it, weighing 66 pounds. mass-produced by the millions of tons and shipped across the world's largest ocean. You're looking at the industrialization of speed, the weaponization of construction, the physical manifestation of American industrial superiority in World War II. And if you could see what Japanese commanders saw when they watched these sections being laid in 1942, 1943, 1944. If you could understand the psychological weight of watching defeat being constructed, methodically and inexorably, faster than you could possibly prevent, you would understand why this story matters, why a piece of perforated steel became one of the most important weapons of the war. Why the ability to build an airfield in 48 hours was more decisive than the ability to win any single battle. The Japanese understood. They watched it happen. They knew what it meant. And they kept fighting anyway, because hope and duty and honor demanded it, even when rational analysis said the war was already lost. That's the human tragedy at the heart of this story. The technology was simple. The logic was inescapable. But the human cost of fighting a war you know you've lost, of sending men to die in defense of positions you know can't be held, of watching your nation's defeat being constructed 10 feet at a time, that cost is almost impossible to comprehend. Almost, but not quite. Because we have the records, we have the memoirs, we have the words of Japanese commanders who looked back after the war and said, with painful honesty, "We ceased to wonder why we were utterly beaten." They understood. And in understanding, they left us this story, a story about steel and speed, about logistics and industrial capacity, about the unglamorous factors that determine wars, about watching defeat arrive, slowly and inexorably, in the form of construction equipment and perforated steel matting, about the sound of sledgehammers and bulldozers, louder than gunfire, because they represented something more permanent than any battle, the sound of the future being built, the sound of the empire ending, the sound of 48 hours that changed everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.